Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today, please welcome Moshik Temkin, author of the book Warriors, Rebels, Saints: The Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X. Moshik, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I really enjoyed the book, and I love history books. So let's start off with you telling us about your background and how you ended up where you're at right now.
Okay, so as you mentioned, I'm a historian. I'm trained as a historian. Really got passionate about it as first as a student, and then I got my PhD at Columbia University, and was teaching as an academic, history, American history, international history of the 20th century. And I got hired at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is a public policy school. And the students there are from all walks of life, and they're in the public policy world, and they're really interested in leadership. In fact, I think that's the main reason why they're there, and that's the main reason why those are the things they want to learn. So I had to figure out a way to make history matter to them, in ways that were meaningful. So I started teaching this class called Leaders and Leadership in History. But it was about 13 years ago now. And it just, I think it kind of struck a chord or hit a nerve, or whatever metaphor you want to use, because leadership is taught in all sorts of ways at Harvard and elsewhere. But I think through teaching it through history, it turned out to be very meaningful and effective. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I've been teaching leaders and leadership in history at Harvard and at other places around the world, and finally decided to turn it into a book that is for the general public, called Warriors, Rebels, and Saints.
And why did you write the book?
I wrote the book during I would say, the second part of the pandemic, as we were, I started it deep in the heart of the pandemic. We were all in isolation, and I made the most of it by writing. I already had the offer to write the book, and I kind of took them on it. And so it was around, I think I wrote it in 2022, and finished it around 2023, and it came out at the end of 2023.
In chapter 1, you contrast the mythologized image of leaders like King David with their deeply human flaws. What do you hope modern readers, especially those in positions of leadership, take away from David's moral failure and its consequences?
So yeah, that chapter that you're referring to, chapter 1, is really about, it starts out by talking about King David, and of course, King David is a very important figure in the Jewish religion, the Christian religion. He's the great king who saw the face of God, was beloved by God. He had defeated Goliath. He's an icon, and he's also, for Christians, he's the ancestor of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ. So very important figure. But here the Bible tells us a very human story about him, very low, about his sin. When he sins with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, and conspires to have him killed so that he can marry Bathsheba. And this is a fairly nasty story, and it leads, of course, to a lot of tumult in his own house and civil war, and his son Absalom rebelling against him. So a reason I wrote that story is, it's two reasons. One is, I think it's very important for anyone who's in a leadership position or is interested in leadership to grapple with who are the leaders that we have in our heads. We all come to the topic of leadership with images of leaders. They're usually great men from history. They could be from mythology, stories that we heard in our childhood, national leaders, biblical leaders, depending who you are. So I wanted to explore this a little bit, how even today we have images of leaders that come all the way from mythology, from very early sources of writing in our culture. The second reason I wrote about it is because I wanted to show that the story of King David as an example of how a leader is both empowered, right? He's a king, he has a lot of power, he's chosen by God. He can basically seemingly do almost whatever he wants. But at the same time, once he sins, once he crosses this moral line, once he displeases God, he's actually punished. And this shows that there are limitations on our leaders. So that is already setting the frame that I kind of follow throughout the book of leaders making history, but also history making the leaders. That every leader, whether or not they have a lot of power or a little bit of power, they also have constraints. They have obstacles that they have to face. They have checks. They have challenges. They have problems. And really, the story of leadership for me, starting with King David, is this interaction between the individual leader and all the things that they can do potentially, and the world, the structures, the society, the ways that they operate, that seem to me also very important.
I think all leaders think they're divine by God, even in modern times
There are
today.
such leaders today, yes.
In your analysis of the David Tamar Absalom narrative, you highlight the tension between divine authority and human leadership. How do you think this biblical portrayal continues to shape modern political expectations or tolerances for leaders who claim moral or divine legitimacy? And you should give a little bit of background about that.
Yeah, so the story there is, of course, without getting into too much detail, is that because David sinned by having Uriah the Hittite killed so that he could basically marry Bathsheba, whom he had impregnated, Uriah's wife. The prophet Nathan comes to him and tells him, you're going to be punished. You have sinned. You have committed a sin. Even though you're a king, you can't do whatever you want. God is watching you. And in fact, one of the things that happens is that all kinds of really horrible things happen in his own household. So one of his sons, Amnon, rapes one of his daughters, Tamar, and then Amnon is killed by Absalom, who is Tamar's full brother, and then Absalom rebels against David, and there all this havoc and tragedy and warfare is happening inside of King David's house, right? So I think the issue there is not so much about the moral constraints, but I think if you look at that story, you can see that from the dawn of civilization, and the Bible is really sort of a very early text that teaches us about ourselves and how we are supposed to live and how we are supposed to codify the world. We have found ways to constrain even the most powerful leaders, right? They didn't have checks and balances. They didn't have democracy. You were not allowed to just rebel against the king because the king is God's chosen. But there is always a higher power. And in the Bible, that's God. Represents a kind of higher authority that even the most powerful king, who has all power over his subjects, can't surpass. So I think the lesson there is that, again, we are always, and all of our leaders, when we look at them, we have to remember that they can't just do whatever they want. There are always things that are above them, ways to keep them in check.
Yeah, I don't think anybody is all powerful. I mean, like when they say, the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world, but even one like our current president, who does really believe that he has ultimate power, there are things roadblocks that come up into play here
Sure,
that
sure.
they have to. Um, there are folks who will stand up and tap and push them and push back at some point, right?
I
Throughout
agree.
history.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's our
Um,
history.
you contrast Machiavelli's focus on individual agency with Marx's emphasis on structural constraints. In today's world, where systemic issues like climate change and global inequality loom large, do you think there's still room for Machiavellian leaders who can stretch constraints or are we increasingly living in a Marxism world where structures dominate outcomes? And I think that needs a little explanation as well.
Sure, sure. So the way this juxtaposition, let's say, between Machiavelli on the one hand and Marx on the other that you mentioned, it's not a political one. It's not about ideology. I just want to emphasize that. It's really about how to think about individual leadership or any leader. So if you're a Machiavelli, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and in Machiavelli's world, he's writing about leaders who have power, and he's showing how they can, and this was a big deal at the time because he wrote it in the 16th century when people still believed that basically God dictated what would happen, right? If you succeeded or failed. And it was, it was really divine. And Machiavelli is saying, no, actually, individual leaders have a hand in how they succeed or fail, and really depends on what they do, what strategies they adopt. And he gave examples of leaders who succeeded or failed based on their decisions and their actions. And we might think today, well, that's banal. That's of course that's true, but it's only banal and true because people like Machiavelli came up with that idea in the first place. So he's very important in that sense. So he puts the emphasis on the individual agency of leaders. Then you have someone like Marx. And now I'm using Marx here not as a political theorist or ideologue. I'm using him as someone who thinks about the world and about society very structurally. He's saying there are very powerful forces in the world. You can talk about, let's say, capitalism is one example, right? So these forces and these structures are so powerful. These systems that we're in are so powerful. You alluded to it right before when you have the US president, but the US president is in a system that it's very difficult for any individual leader to really make a difference, to really change things. And so one leader after another comes, but the system stays the same, the structure stays the same. And these are really two different views of leadership. And I honestly, Mark, I come down a little bit, not so much in the middle, but I think that any intelligent, sophisticated, useful analysis of leadership has to acknowledge both sides. We know from history that there have been very important individual leaders who changed the world, right? But we also know that we have very powerful forces in our society, structures, especially economic, social structures, that are very difficult to dislodge. And leaders have to maneuver in this world. And so I think what's really fascinating for me as a historian of leadership is to look at the dynamic between these two things, to see leaders making history in some cases, but in other cases, history sort of overcoming a leader or actually turning out to be more important or more powerful than the leader.
Yeah, I always like Doris Goodwin Curtin's book, Team of Rivals. It's one of my favorite books about that and how everything changed. That those guys that Lincoln surrounded himself with all thought he was below them. But by the time they ended up working with him for a few years, they realized he was way above them and how he navigated all that to keep the country together and how he put his own ego in check and gave people lots of room to show whether they could make it or not make it.
Yes.
It's an amazing story and one that
It is.
many leaders take a look at and see how they measure up to that.
It's hard, but it's interesting, just as a follow-up, Lincoln is not really subject in my book, but he's a good example of what I just described. You can't understand, we know Lincoln is extremely important, right? We know what he did. We know the place that he has in American history. But you can't understand Lincoln's as an individual leader without understanding where he comes from, the world that made him, where he grew up, the values that he had, right? The political influences that he had, his personality, the forces that shaped him, right? So Lincoln doesn't come out of the sky, right? He's not a magical figure. He's human, and he has a past like we all do. He has a biography. So I'm always interested, okay, what did Lincoln do? How did he do it? But I'm also interested in what made Lincoln. How did Lincoln even become Lincoln, right, in the first place? Those are the two sides that I'm talking about.
You mentioned that some of the most impactful leaders, those who become warriors, rebels, and saints, often don't hold formal power. What criteria do you believe distinguishes these informal leaders as historically significant when they don't succeed by conventional standards? And can you give some examples?
Sure. So we have leaders who have formal power, and you can talk about Lincoln, who's US president. That's a lot of power. We can talk about King David. He's a king. He has a lot of power, etc. There are many examples of this. But then there are leaders that we know in history who don't have formal power. So I'll give you one example, very important for American history. Martin Luther King Jr. He's a very important leader in American history, but he has no formal institutional power. He's a social leader. He's a civil rights leader. And he has his organization, but there's no authority behind it. He's not a national leader. He has no army. He's not a state leader. He has a cause, and he has people following him. And these kinds of leader, and there are other examples, the suffragist leaders in the United States who had to find ways to change the political system. Or if you think about people even with even less power who resisted tyranny in the 20th century, resistance fighters in Europe in World War II, or people who fought for independence in the colonial world, right? In India, in anywhere that you can think of in the getting independence from empires. These are not people or leaders who had formal power. So these kinds of people have to find their power elsewhere, not inside the formal places, not where you have authority, but in other sources. So I think for someone like Martin Luther King Jr., that power comes from the moral cause, from the ideas that he's able to convey, from the energy that he can channel from his world, from his camp, from the people that he represents and who believe in what he's saying. And we can see from history that those people often turn out to be the most powerful.
It's also very interesting that most of these strong leaders were small physically. Martin Luther King was like 5'6". Stalin was short. I mean, many of these leaders were not what people envision in terms, I mean, aside from Lincoln, tall, imposing figures.
Well,
Mao was tall,
we have the famous Napoleon complex, right? So
right?
we talk about that. Um, I confess that I have not done a statistical study of the correlation between height and power and leadership. Honestly, Mark, I'll say I think leaders come in all shapes and sizes, and I don't think that there's anything determined about that. But I agree with you that there's no impediment, right? That the things that we might find conventional for associating with power or presence or charisma or authority, they don't always apply. In particular, in situations where uh, you know, in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., it doesn't really matter that much because there are bigger issues at stake, right? It's not just about the image that he's presenting. He's talking about something very deep. So I think that the words and the way that he said those things gave him height, right? Even if he didn't have the physical height.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. In examining the failures and successes of leaders like Hoover and Roosevelt during the Great Depression, what qualities do you believe are most essential for leadership in times of crisis?
Yeah, so you're referring to the transition during the early part of the Great Depression, it starts in 1929 and really sort of gets to its worst point in the 1930s, early 1930s, in the United States and then in the world. And the president, when the Depression hits, is Herbert Hoover, who was actually elected as a very admired figure. He had never run for office before. He's seen as just a very successful entrepreneur, and he'd been a humanitarian, and people really respected him. And then crisis hits, and it turns out that Hoover was the right kind of leader for a situation of peace and stability, but not the right kind of leader for a crisis. because he revealed himself to be way too lackadaisical for the kind of response that the people need in a situation of crisis. In a situation of crisis, people are really seeking a dynamic leader who intervenes, who does things, right? Who shows that they're able to respond to what's happening and they're able to empathize with people's struggles and suffering. And that leader turned out to be Roosevelt, who was, in my opinion, the most important US president since Lincoln, really. The main reason he's so important is because you have this meeting between the political personality of Roosevelt and the crisis that the United States was going through, first the Great Depression and then World War II. And Roosevelt won 4 elections. They had to put in term limits afterwards. So, that wouldn't happen again, at least for now. That's been holding. But he won 4 elections in landslides with a coalition that consisted of voters who otherwise would have very little to do with each other on social, cultural, religious, and other issues, because what they had in common was the belief that Roosevelt was really addressing their problems, their basic economic problems. And so he turned out to be an excellent leader for a crisis moment. And what I find with the juxtaposition between a Herbert Hoover, and a Roosevelt is that the leaders that are right for times of stability are not necessarily the leaders that are right for a crisis. And vice versa. There are leaders who I think you want them in times of crisis, but they're really crisis leaders. You don't necessarily want them when there is no crisis, because there are leaders who only thrive in a crisis, and they'll create a crisis if there's no crisis going on.
Isn't that how people felt about Churchill? Here he led them through World War II, and then he didn't get reelected after World War II. I think people put him in that bucket of saying, great in a crisis, but I'm not sure he's the right guy in a peaceful time. And Obama seemed to me to come up big, that he was the right person at the right time during the crash in 2008.
Right. So I think there are many examples of this where I'll give you a completely different example from another country. So you have Mao in China, very important leader in world history and in Chinese history, right? He was what I would consider to be a very successful and significant revolutionary leader. So as a revolutionary in China, he's able to completely transform the country, change its political system, establish the Chinese Communist Party as the dominant force. They're still there today, right?
Yeah.
But then Mao, as the leader of China after the revolution, is actually quite disastrous.
Yeah.
And the main reason, I think, there's all kinds of reasons, but the main reason is because Mao is not the leader that you want when now you need to develop a country, you need to govern it, you need to find stability, you need to grow. Mao was a revolutionary. So even as a national leader, he still needs to create revolution. And that creates disaster and chaos. So Mao, there's really 2 Maos. There's the crisis Mao, revolutionary Mao, and then there's the Mao who's the national leader. And they actually have very different results.
And that's like business. There are entrepreneurs who are great in the startup mode, but once the company starts to become much larger and scale up, they're not good at that part of it. It's very
Yeah, I've
rare
seen that
that,
too. You have the
yeah,
visionaries, right? And those who
yeah.
are they are really good at navigating the difficulties of getting something off the ground, creating something from scratch, finding the right people, etc. But then, yeah, now you're sitting when you're, now you're in the sort of driver's seat, and now you might not be the right person. It might be time to hand it over to somebody who really knows how to manage.
How do you assess the role of public perception and charisma versus substantive policy in determining a leader's effectiveness during national emergencies? A lot of people really love the charismatic figure who might not be that substantive or have the intellectual firepower to deal with complex issues.
Right. I think so. Let's talk about 3 examples. The first is, yeah, there's charismatic. Now, charisma can be subjective. Different leaders have different appeals to different people. But I agree that there is such a thing called charisma. We tend to respond to certain leaders because of their appeal and their charisma, or however you want to define it. And there are very often leaders that's it. That's what they have. They have a kind of charisma and appeal, but they don't have much substance, and they're not really tackling the problems that people have. And this is a big problem that we face now, I think, in our world, politically speaking. Then you have another kind of figure who is, I would say, the very substantive person who has very good ideas and can give you an excellent platform, and the policies look great, but they're just not able to convey them in a very effective way. They're not able to express them in an exciting way. They can't really catch fire, right? And that's that. So they're also limited, right? And they don't, and therefore they can't bring about the change. Ideally, you want someone who combines both those things. So let's revert back to the example of Roosevelt. Roosevelt he was not an intellectual, and he wasn't a particularly sophisticated person, but he had very good ideas. He had good political instincts, and he had very good ideas about what the people needed and what the people wanted in a time of crisis. And he also had the ability to appeal to the public. So the fireside chats, we all learn about it at school. What was the fireside chats? It's very simple. It's Roosevelt is explaining directly to every listener in America, and in those days it was the radios, no TV, no Facebook, no, none of that. And he's just talking about what he and his government, what his administration are doing to help people. And it's like, this week we did this, and here's how it helped these people, and here's how it helped those people. And he does it in such a conversational, effective, friendly way that he's considered a pioneer in communication. So when you get that meeting between the, let's say, charisma and the substance, then you're onto something good. The trick is to make the ideas good so that the charisma works for good. You don't want charisma to work for harmful things. And we also have many examples of that in history, where you have a leader who is charismatic, but that just brought about, destruction, death, suffering for people in all sorts of ways.
Given the historical context, do you think Roosevelt's willingness to challenge institutional norms was justified, or did it just risk undermining democratic principles?
Yeah, so that's the question of how Roosevelt handled certain obstacles during the implementation of the New Deal. So the most famous is the so-called court packing attempt that he made in 1937 when it became clear that the Supreme Court, which was basically as conservative then as it is now, even though it looked very different, was going to strike down two of its most important measures. One was the Social Security Act, and the other was the minimum wage laws. And these were the two measures that helped the poorest people in America. And then Roosevelt was basically saying, look, with all respect to the Supreme Court, I have a responsibility to feed the people who are starving, and I have to, and the people voted for me to enact this. And the Supreme Court doesn't have the validity, the legitimacy to prevent me from doing this. So I'm not going to just destroy the Supreme Court or ignore the Supreme Court, but I'm going to start trying to appoint more justices so that we get more people in there and a majority that will say that these things are constitutional. And it worked. He intimidated them, he bullied them, and they kind of changed their mind. And since then, we've had a debate. Historians have been debating whether what Roosevelt did was democratic or anti-democratic, because if you really believe in these institutions, you'll say, no, he was being very dictatorial, authoritarian. He was bullying the Supreme Court. You can't have the president do that. That's anti-democratic. But on the other hand, if he didn't do that, then you let the Supreme Court dictate who lives and dies. And a lot of people say, well, that's not very democratic either. These people are not elected. Roosevelt was elected to enact the New Deal. So he's doing it for the public good. So my take on it is that it's very simple. If he had not done that, if the United States had let the people just starve, then I think democracy might not have survived. The whole world was going either fascist or communist at that time. And I think Roosevelt was able to protect the American system and capitalism by making these sacrifices within the system and by bullying the institutions that were standing in his way.
What parallels do you see between the political challenges faced by Roosevelt and those confronting leaders in today's global crisis?
They're very similar. They're very similar. The we face a crisis. I mean, this is a crisis happening all over the world where masses of people, and I'm talking especially about the democratic world or the countries that have democracies, more or less democracies, people feel left behind. People feel that the gaps between themselves and elites, let's say, whether they're financial elites or cultural elites or whatever elites you want to choose, that the gaps are getting bigger and bigger, and that they're not taken into account, and their lives are getting worse, and they're not being listened to. And when that happens, people turn on the system, they turn on their leaders, they turn on the establishment, and then we have to see how leaders behave. And I think that right now in the world, we're seeing a lot of leaders who are simply unable to address this problem properly. And what happens is that when you have leaders who can't address this problem, you get other leaders coming in and saying, well, I'm going to take care of this problem. And usually they do it by scapegoating. They'll say, oh, it's because of immigrants, or it's because of women, or I don't know. That has happened a lot in history, and I think it's happening now all over the world. But I think that Roosevelt faced similar problems. He faced a society in really deep crisis, the worst we've ever had, economically speaking, and he handled it by making sure that the government was responsive to the people who were the most in need, and that they felt listened to, and that they felt that they really had a leader who was looking out for them and not turning them against other parts of the population. So we really don't have right now that much of a kind of Roosevelt spirit, I think. We have leaders who are either ducking the problems or exploiting the problems for their own political and sometimes financial benefit. And that's part of the leadership crisis that I think we face today.
Yeah, I agree with you totally about that. In chapter 3, what do you see as the most significant obstacles for leaders who operate without formal authority, and how can they overcome these barriers to affect change?
So I think, chapter 3 deals with the suffrage struggle in the United States. And it was really 3, maybe even 4 generations of women who fought for the right to vote, right? And which we might take for granted today, that in a democracy, all adults should be able to vote, men and women. But that was not the case, as we know, and women were denied the right to vote until relatively recently, right? In 1920, that changes at the national level. But how did that happen? Well, they had to struggle. But the struggle is very difficult because you have to kind of first of all, you have to convince your own group of that it's something worth struggling for, right? To convince them that they actually deserve to have these rights. They deserve to vote, right? You have to unify them. Then you also have to convince the people who do have the power to grant you the right to vote. So that's a challenge, right? So I think what eventually worked for the suffrage movement, as leaders who didn't really have formal power, institutional power, is that they learned techniques. They learned to do communication properly. They learned to unify across class lines, across social lines, across race lines. They were able to find allies among men who supported them enough so that eventually they were able to convince President Wilson to kind of get behind the 19th Amendment and grant women the right to vote. So I think in situations like this, the challenge is to convince people that getting together and unifying doesn't hurt their interests, that they actually gain more with solidarity than just by thinking of themselves as separate groups looking out just for themselves.
In the context of suffrage movement, how do you evaluate the relative effectiveness of working within the system versus adopting a more radical and confrontational tactics, which I think we see a lot with community organizers and those folks, especially over the last 5 years, when there's been a lot of social upheaval, not just in the United States, but around the world. Community activism.
Yeah, this is a long debate. This is a debate that I hear over and over again between people who actually share a goal. They want to change the system. They don't like the status quo. In that case, it was suffrage. Again, they say, well, we want to get women the right to vote, but then there's a big difference in terms of strategy. Now, some people in that situation will say, no, we have to work with institutions. We have to create partnerships. We have to be very pragmatic. We have to be even, we have to assuage people's worries and anxieties, and we have to find support within the institution and within the mainstream. And that's the way we get progress. And then there's other people. So that kind of person was, let's say, Carrie Chapman Catt, very important suffrage leader, the mainstream of the suffrage movement. Then there were other leaders in that movement, people like Alice Paul, who had a very different approach, because she said, look, no, the way to do this is we have to create pressure, and the pressure has to come from outside. We have to make a spectacle. So these people believed in mass demonstrations. They believed in getting themselves arrested, thrown in prison, getting notoriety that way, really bringing attention to their cause, and demanding that the change happen right now. And it's a much more anti-institutional approach. And I think the difference is not just strategic because of thinking, well, this might work versus that might work. I think it's often very temperamental. You probably see this all the time, that there are leaders who have that kind of very institutional-minded temperament. They're very mainstream. They're very focused on partnerships and allies and working within the system. And then there are kind of figures, leaders, who are very much outsiders. They want to disrupt. They want to bring down the existing authority or bosses, wherever it is. And they think that that's the way to get ahead and get what they want. And I think what we see in this case, as in others, is that it's going to be some combination of the two. There has to be, these two, it's like a two-pronged approach, and one won't be effective without the other. They might not like each other, but they need each other.
In chapter 4, what distinguishes meaningful resistance from mere survival under authoritarian regimes? And how do we define leadership in such extreme context?
Well, chapter 4 is really about leading when you have no power. And by no power, I mean that very act of becoming a leader puts you at risk. And in this case, it would be, there's two examples that I give there. One is what it was like to be in the resistance in, let's say, Nazi-occupied Europe. And the other is what it was like to fight against the dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. Rafael Trujillo's very notorious, infamous dictatorship for it lasted 30 years. And so in this case, we have leaders who they risk their lives, and they're usually anonymous, because if people know who they are, they're going to get killed, or they're going to get arrested and killed, at least imprisoned. So these are people who really go to the extreme to lead, and they do it at great sacrifice, because many of them, we don't even know their names. We don't know who they were, but we know that they fought for a cause, and we know that they were very, very significant. The reality is that most people in situations of tyranny and dictatorship, what they'll do is they'll keep their head down, right? If they're not in danger themselves, they'll keep their head down. They'll just try to live their normal lives, try to, take care of themselves and their families, and just try to wait things out. And that's how most people behave in history. And it's to be expected, because we have a survival instinct. So that's the difference. We know from the past that in situations of, let's say, tyranny, of fascism and totalitarianism and so on, there were actually very few people who really stood up. But those are the people, sometimes totally anonymously, who really changed the course of history, and we kind of remember their examples many, many years later.
What do you think of, as a historian looking at this now, where we have all of these protests all over the United States, about was it no time for kings?
Yeah, no kings, something like that.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, I think I'll say two things. One thing that I think is, I want to say one thing that is maybe looking at it positively, and one thing that is more skeptical. So the positive thing I want to say is that it's still very important that people believe in their ability to express themselves, to change, to that they're able to go out in the street and peacefully and say what they think, and express their unhappiness with a leader that they consider to be a very bad or harmful leader. That's very important, and that's actually the sign. It can be a sign that we're in political crisis, but it's also the sign of a healthy society, right? A society in which protest is still there, in which people still have a kind of consciousness about what's happening, and it's a civic health, I would say, that's very important. On the other hand, I don't know how effective it is. I don't know if it brings about any change. It feels almost like a symbolic event. People go on the street and they protest, then they go home, and the next day you wake up and things are the same. So I think people who really want to be leaders affecting change are going to have to do something more than use slogans or just go out and have a day of protest. I think that we either have to work within the system or outside the system, but leaders, even young leaders, even local leaders, even leaders who are just starting out as leaders, they have to find ways to be effective. So, in historical perspective, I would say it's a sign of life. Whether you like this kind of protest or not, whether you like their ideas or not, it's a sign of democracy. But at the same time, it's not enough to really affect change, I think.
isn't that how all things kind of start? First, they start with the peaceful demonstrations, and then when people find uh, they're not getting a response, then they ratchet it up. And you see that with everything. When unions are negotiating, they start off with, okay, here's what we think is fair. But then when nothing happens, they go, okay, I guess we got to hit the nuclear button. And now we're going to shut the whole thing down and we're going to protest all this.
Well, I think that what you see there is like it's an escalation, but normally that happens when, negotiations are not, as you say, you start out, let's say, okay, let's negotiate. Let's see, okay, that's your position, my position. But if the one side feels that, the basic needs are not being met, and there's an unfairness to the situation, then they're going to use whatever leverage they have, right? In the case of unions, it'll be, let's say, a strike or some, work disturbances or whatever it is. And I think that that's to be expected. We know in our society that for some, it's much easier to wield power. If you're a president or if you're the board of a company, you have automatically more power than the workers or somebody who's working in a lowly position. That's why, we have unions. The only thing that unions really have is strength in numbers and the ability to withhold labor. So then they use that. But what we're seeing there is the same thing. It's like a two-pronged approach. There's like the carrot and the stick. And ideally, in a healthy situation, you're going to try the carrot first. And then if that doesn't work, then you turn to the stick.
But it seems the stick always ends up having to come out because people in power don't feel like they have to actually pay attention to anybody until it gets to a boiling point.
Right. Well, because we know that people who have power don't just willingly give it up. And we know that people who have the advantage don't people at the top don't willingly give up their place. We see it all over, in history. We see it when you had, let's say, anti-colonial struggles, when you had civil rights struggles, when you had workers' rights struggles, women's rights struggles, gay rights struggles. All of these struggles had to have a component that was a more radical component, a more militant, to show that people are actually willing to fight. And that's what, when we talk about the structures, right? What Marx was talking about, uh, that's why you also, Marx would also reach the conclusion, and he did reach the conclusion, that eventually the only thing that can dislodge these structures was a revolution, right? And that's how you get to, Marxist political theory. And so I'm not saying we should go that far, but I think you're right, Mark, that most of the time the dynamic is that power only cedes power under pressure and under threat.
Yeah, always, right? I mean, I've never seen a time where people, for the most part, act reasonable, even people negotiating contracts or whatever, until someone's really well, the other side's willing to walk away, the one trying to see if they can come to a negotiated understanding.
Right,
The other side doesn't respect them and doesn't take them seriously. And that's why these things always end up being in the case.
right.
In your view of what are ethical boundaries for resistance when confronting violent or genocidal regimes, how should leaders navigate these dilemmas?
You mean in resisting genocide or resisting violence?
Yes.
That's a very difficult question that leaders have had to face. I'm talking about leaders of, um, in situations of trying to fight back against really violent, even murderous oppression. Okay, these are very extreme cases in history. Now, some might say, if you're a pacifist, some might say, no, any form of resistance that is violent is immoral, and that if you fight violence with violence, then basically you're the same, you're equivalent. And that in history, that argument is a very powerful one. And even Gandhi in India expressed some idea of this sort. He wanted nonviolent resistance. He wanted the resistance to colonialism, British, colonialism in India, to be um, sort of nonviolent civic disobedience, because he thought that the morality of that gave the struggle a power that it would never have if it were a violent struggle. Okay, so um, that is a very powerful argument. On the other hand, we know, as you just pointed out, that in history, the history of almost all independence movements, including the United States, by the way, but many countries around the world that have their independence, it only came through warfare and violence, um, and that it's easy to say, "Oh, I don't want to be violent. I want nonviolence," but the reality in history is that most of the time people got their freedom through violent struggle, because they found, not because they were inherently violent, but because they found themselves really confronted with that or nothing. This
Always
happens over
backed
and over
into a
again.
corner.
Yeah. So I think that, realistically speaking, I'm myself not a violent person at all, but I'm also a historian who's very realistic about these dynamics. So when I see in history a struggle that turned violent, I want to see how it turned violent. So I think when you're confronting genocide, when you're confronting really bad, extreme cases of violence, then we have to understand sometimes that people could only fight back with the tools that they had, and sometimes those tools were whatever violence that they could use.
In your research, what have you found to be the most significant factors that lead leaders to cross ethical lines in the pursuit of victory, security, or even great wealth?
Yeah, I think that the lines are often crossed when you work yourself into a state of all or nothing. So one example that I have in the book is World War II, specifically the war between Japan and the United States, right? And I know many people listening to us have saw the film Oppenheimer, which came out 2 years ago, and
Yeah.
so I feel like everybody saw the movie. and I was actually finishing up the book when this movie came out. I wrote about Oppenheimer in the book before I saw the movie, but it's a great example. I didn't, this is how does someone like Oppenheimer, who's a very peaceful man, and he's reading Sanskrit texts and he's kind of very spiritual. He's a scientist. He didn't get into science to kill people or to build this weapon of mass destruction. He got into science to make the world better, to help people, and to, just his own sort of curiosity about the world and so on. How do we get to a point where even scientists like this and a whole system of knowledge is drawn into a war effort that ends with just annihilating people, children, civilians in Japanese cities at the end of World War II? Well, that happens because of the idea of, well, we have a total war and we need to win this war at all costs. And so even if you think, well, the war was justified and we had to defeat Japan, you also have to look at the price that we paid for that, right? And so I think that this is a war crime no matter what. Just killing people, civilians in that way is a war crime. But it happens because the idea was that you have to win. You have to win this war no matter what. And I think this applies also to the business world in a different way. I think it applies to our public life in a different way, where it's a winner takes all mentality, where it's an all or nothing mentality, where we're really atomized as individuals in competition with each other. And I think when we are in that mindset, then even good people find themselves or wind up really crossing lines.
No, I guess I can't help but to ask this question since I'm in Vietnam. What do you see as the primary causes of leadership failure in situations where leaders have every advantage, as is in the case of the Vietnam War?
The Vietnam War is a fascinating case study. The reason that it's from the American, I'm thinking right now just from the American side, right? So the reason that it's fascinating is because the people who led the United States to the disaster of the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War was a total disaster, right? Militarily, politically, and so on. And it was also full of criminality and atrocities. It's a very bleak story. But the people who led the United States into that war were not incompetent at all. They were brilliant people. They were considered the so-called best and the brightest, as David Halberstam called them in his famous book on the
Yeah.
topic. And Robert McNamara was the ultimate example of this. Here's a guy who comes from a modest background and he really comes up meritocratically. He's considered to be one of the smartest kids in all of America. He goes to fight, is in World War II, doing the air power thing over Japan. So there's the great movie, The Fog of War, done by Errol Morris in 2003, which basically is a series of interviews with him about Vietnam. And he's the architect of the Vietnam War. The smartest person in every room he was ever in, and really knew how to do quantitative analysis. And this is the person who led the country into such a disaster and wreaked such destruction and havoc on Vietnam and the Vietnamese people and the Cambodian people eventually, and Laos and so on. So I wanted to know how that happens. Somebody with all the advantages and all the education and all the brilliance. And I think what happens there is it's just two things. One is this kind of over-reliance on the expertise without looking at the history, right? So you try to understand things from the perspective of the Vietnamese, that they're not just part of your sort of geopolitical drawing board, but they have their own history, their own society, their own priorities. That's the first thing. The second thing is when you have a public servant like McNamara, who instead of serving the public, he begins to just think of himself as a servant to power. So he basically starts just doing what LBJ, what Lyndon Johnson, the president, wanted him to do, which is to find ways to just kill more people in Vietnam because he couldn't give up on that war. And that was a disaster because even McNamara knew, and he was saying it from the beginning, that in a way it was an unwinnable war. So I think there you see the failure of leadership when leadership kind of is just about power. And that can lead to a disaster.
It's funny, living here in Vietnam for 2 years, that they've been a country for like 1,000 years. People come
Right.
countries conquer them for short periods of time, throughout their history, but they never end up staying. And Vietnam has always kind of controlled their own destiny, whether it's the French, the British, the U.S. coming in, whoever it is. They're a very resilient group of people,
They
and
are.
they're not physically big, and they've never had, huge industrial might. You think about the U.S. coming off of World War II in Korea, and you think if in a fight, they're going to get crushed quickly, and that just
Mil
wasn't the
mil
case.
millions of people died, were killed, but they made it clear from the beginning that they were not going to give up on their independence, and no amount of U.S. pressure would make them give up, and they would fight to the last man and woman and child, and that was it. That was the story. And I think that American leaders, because of this hubris that they had of power, they just didn't understand that. And even today, I'm sorry, but we have to say this. It seems that we don't learn those lessons because it seems like every generation repeats the same mistake. We just think we can impose our power and our will on around the world on countries we don't like, or and just kind of change them, but it doesn't work that way. And there are other countries, by the way, like Vietnam, that have been around for 1,000 or 2,000 years, and they get invaded repeatedly and colonized, and eventually and they're still around and still independent. And I'm very wary that the lessons of Vietnam have not been learned in terms of leadership.
No question about it. Here's the last question. Looking ahead, what models of leadership do you find most promising for tackling the interconnected crises of the 21st century?
So I like that you use the word interconnected, Mark, because I think that's the key. So I want to preface that the last chapter that I wrote is about our era and our future, and it starts with a discussion of Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism. And I consider Margaret Thatcher to be the most important political leader of her generation, not just in the UK, but in the world, in terms of her influence on our world, our politics, the way we think about our society, about our economy, and our relationship to each other. And I think it's it's not just a political influence, but it's a psychic one. And it's one that really puts the emphasis on individuals, competition between individuals. And to think about ourselves not as a society, not as people interlinked, connected to each other across borders, across social groups, across classes, but in competition with each other, even in hostility towards each other, and in rivalry with each other. And I think that that's the world that we're in, where it's every man, woman, child, and invalid for themselves. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we're trained that way. We think about our success as individual success, and we think about leadership as individual leadership. We're very focused on that, and we learn about that very early on. And I think some of the great leaders that I write about in the book, including Martin Luther King Jr., but others, didn't think of leadership as individual leadership. They thought about it collectively. They thought about it as the measure of success wasn't just your individual success, but the collective success and progress that you were able to bring to others. So I think the model of leadership for me isn't any particular world leader or national leader that I want to single out, but the people out there who are really thinking in a civic-minded way, in an open way, about how to make the world better for as many people as possible, right? Not just for their own success and benefit, although it's nice to be successful and to be wealthy and to win, right? But we don't want to just think about it as at the expense of other people and as defeating other people. And I think that that's a malaise that has really affected our society. And a lot of the problems we have are connected to that hyper individuality. So that's my model of leadership for the future. It's people, especially younger people, and I hope that they kind of take inspiration from this, to look at these examples from history and to see that the best way to move forward through these challenges is to understand that we're all sharing the planet, right? And we all have problems that affect each other, and to understand it that way.
I have to say, I really enjoyed this hour, and I could spend the rest of the day just talking to
Oh,
you.
thank you, Mark.
And I really enjoyed the book, and I hope everybody will buy it because I think it's a great read. And I hope that you'll write something else so that we can have you back again.
I hope to. I also, well, I'm writing things, and so we'll be in touch about that. But I really appreciate your questions, Mark, and talking to you. And thanks for everybody who has been listening in and listens into this.
Everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to listen today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.